Hello, I am Dorine van Norren. I am a researcher from the Netherlands associated to Leiden University. I am also a policymaker and in my free time I'm an artist. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today, and I'm sorry I cannot visit your wonderful country of Korea, but I hope to do so in the future. We are going to speak about 3 philosophies of the Global South related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And now I will return to my presentation. We are going to speak about COVID-19 and possible new ways of a new economy from the perspective of 3 philosophies of the Global South, namely Buddhist happiness or Asian empathic G&H economy, Ubuntu, the African concept of sharing, and Buen Vivir from Latin America, which is a Latin embrace of good living. This is derived from my PhD called Development as Service. It was done in 2017 at the Tilburg University, and the title is derived from the idea of Amartya Sen, the famous economist who got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. He wrote a book, Development as Freedom. And in that book he said we need to look not at GDP growth or economic growth as a measure of progress, but we need to look at rights and freedoms and how humans can actualize their rights and freedoms and have a meaningful life. Now, I fully agree with that, except for the fact from the perspectives of the 3 philosophies of the Global South that I studied, this idea of Amartya Sen, though he comes from India, is still a very individualist idea of looking at rights and freedoms. And from the 3 philosophies of African Ubuntu, Asian Buddhist happiness, and Buen Vivir in Latin America, the idea of reciprocity or service is very important. Therefore, I have termed my PhD Development as Service. So progress is constituted as reciprocity and not as GDP growth or realizing individualist freedoms. We will have a number of speakers for you, of which one is about African Ubuntu, and that is Professor Mogoba Ramose from South Africa. We have 2 speakers for you from the idea of Latin American or Native American Buen Vivir, which is Dr. Henk-Jan Laats and Professor Alberto Acosta from Ecuador, Henk-Jan Laats being from the Netherlands. And thirdly, we have a speaker from Bhutan on Buddhist happiness or gross national happiness, which is Dr. Karma Ura, the director of the Center for Bhutan Studies. Now we go back to the COVID-19 pandemic, the causes and consequences of it. One of the causes of the COVID-19 pandemic is that it is a zoonotic virus. That means that it is a virus that transfers from animals to humans. And the occurrence of such viruses happens more often in environmentally degraded area where the nature is depleted, in bioindustry, for example, or in depleted natural areas. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic that has been lasting so long may have possible consequences for how we organize society and how we organize the economy. We do not know that yet, so I am just going to offer you a few suggestions. So the questions that we may be raising regarding the economy may be about the idea of globalization and international value change. So are we going to continue producing globally, or will we also produce more locally because all of the global value chains have been disrupted? Think, for example, of the medical masks that were all produced in China, and there are cries from other countries that we need to produce them locally so that we have more national security. Secondly, and relatedly, is of course the idea of free trade, which we have been promoting from the West, versus ideas of protectionism also out of social or environmental reasons, which we have seen more recently emerging from the United States. Secondly, there may be consequences for the way we are organizing taxation. So who are we going to tax and who is going to benefit from those taxes? I will come back to these questions at the end of my presentations and give you a few suggestions. Thirdly, we're going to talk about the idea of international and financial trade flows and the fact that much of our economy is based on the idea of speculation. So speculation in financial products, which caused the 2008 global financial crisis, but also speculation in food or in other areas of society like housing. Fourthly, we can talk about the consequences for democracy and the rule of law, a central tenet of our international system, and the fact that there is increasingly more surveillance and more worries about privacy because of data collection in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Furthermore, we have seen that there is more geopolitical rivalry recently. So rivalry over who was to blame for the pandemic and who is responsible for the solutions. So might there be a shift from geopolitical rivalry towards more solidarity between states, regions, and inside multilateral institutions such as the IMF or the United Nations or the World Health Organization? Lastly, we will also talk about transborder collective problems such as climate and health pandemics and how do we solve them? Is the current system internationally sufficient or do we need to move to a different system? But before we answer these questions, we are going to make a tour around the world. And the first continent where we're going to make a stop is Africa. I have personally lived in South Africa and there I encountered the idea of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I am because we are. I am a person through other persons. So I as an individual do not exist. I only exist because you as a community are also there. So I am part of a community. I do not stand alone. So it is a collectivist worldview which very much centers around sharing amongst humans. But humans in the African thought is defined differently than humans in the Western thought. So the idea of human or people, which is called Bantu in African languages, actually sums up the ancestors, the people who are living now and the people who are yet to be born or the future generations. So all of these people constitute the community of humanity. So Ubuntu requires an intergenerational solidarity between the ancestors, the people who are living now, and the unborn. And you can see the concept of Ubuntu in the picture above, in which humans are sitting in a circle and sharing their ideas. But the Ubuntu is a much more profound idea, in which actually the word can be cut up in two, the word Ubu and the word Natu. So the word Ubu means abstract being before it manifests, and the word Natu signifies the life force being. And both of them meet in the word Ubu Natu, meaning abstract beings coming into life. You can see Ubu being signified by the black circle of abstract being and the life force being the yellow stripes, bringing it to life. So the word Bantu consists of two syllables, namely the word Ba, or abstract people that have not manifested yet, being brought into life by the life force Natu. So this signifies that everything is connected by the life force Natu, because all the words end on the word Natu. So the word for person is Muntu, and the word for people is Bantu. From Africa, and we're coming back to this concept, We go now to Latin America to the concept of buen vivir, or good living in Spanish, which is called summa causa in the language of the Quechua people, or the indigenous people of Ecuador, Bolivia and Peru. This idea of the right way of living or good living centers very much about Mother Earth, which you can see on the picture here. So Mother Earth is the life giver, and Earth and nature and humans are all connected, and therefore we call this a biocentric life view, centered around Mother Earth. It is all about creating harmony with nature, living in harmony with nature, and because you live in harmony with nature, you can also live in harmony with others and in harmony with yourself. It's very much about balancing the spiritual and material wealth and looking at life in a cyclical way, so not a linear time concept, but everything comes and goes in cycles like the seasons. On this second picture, you can see many beautiful animals, plants, nature, rock, and there is also a small human being, if you look very carefully, behind the tree. This signifies to me that the human is equal to animals, plants, nature, rocks and mountains, and it is not above nature. It is a subject and equal to all other living beings. And from this concept, the Ecuadorians and Bolivians derive the idea of rights of nature. So not only humans have rights in human rights, but nature also has rights, and they have put that in the constitution, and they have also had court cases fighting for the right of nature to exist and to be respected. We will come back to all of this at the end. But first we go to the third continent, which is the continent of Asia, which you are also from. And in Asia, the country of Bhutan has invented a concept which they call the gross national happiness, which is basically rooted in the culture of Buddhism. Gross national happiness as opposed to gross national product as we know it, or economic growth. So they measure well-being in a much broader sense than only economic terms. And they rest that culture on 4 pillars. They say that basically culture or identity is the foundation of everything, underlying everything. Just like Ubuntu in Africa underlies the way Africans live and think. So other than culture, they have defined socio-economic well-being, nature, the well-being of nature, and good governance as the 4 dimensions in which they want to measure the well-being of their society. And furthermore, they have cut that down in 9 domains. And those 9 domains are unconventional domains mixed with conventional domains such as health and education and living standards. So some of the unconventional domains are, for example, the circle, the blue circle on the right, mentioning time use. How many hours do you sleep and how many hours do you work? They also measure, for example, the purple circle on the left and the bottom, which says community vitality. So how much of your free time are you donating for a good cause, or how much of your money are you giving to society for free for a good cause? How are the community relationships? Furthermore, the green circle on the top measures, for example, psychological well-being. How is your life satisfaction, your positive or negative emotions, and how are you doing in your spirituality? Now we see in the GNH index in Bhutan that as the country is westernizing, those unconventional domains of community vitality, the way we use our time, the amount of rest that we take, and also the psychological well-being is going down. So the GDP growth is going up in Bhutan, but the other dimensions are going down. So the question is this really progress? I leave that question to you. Underlying gross national happiness is the whole philosophy of Buddhism, which we cannot go into now. But you probably all have heard of the Four Noble Truths, that we suffer because we crave for the material. And if we relinquish our desire for the material, we will reach more happiness. And for that we need to walk the Eightfold Path towards enlightenment. But the other interesting feature which I want to highlight is the idea of yin-yang. Because the idea of yin-yang, I discovered, has a relationship with the idea of Ubuntu in Africa. Because yin-yang also consists of two things: the masculine patterns or abstract being, and the feminine matter or maternal being, which is the earthly being. So the patterns were Ubu in Africa, and Tu is the life force being, or the black circle of yin. So here we can see that the philosophies can also communicate with each other. So if we compare these philosophies, the Western, the African, the Latin American and the Asian ones, we can say a few general things. The Western idea of progress is very much a hierarchical organized society in which there are developed countries and developing countries. Therefore, we have chosen the slogan, "Leave no one behind," for the Sustainable Development Goals. It suggests a hierarchy of being. It's very much based in the idea of economic growth, so a linear progress based on extractivism or taking natural resources for human use and then redistributing the benefits in society. The idea of Ubuntu, if I have to summarize it, is very much life as mutual aid. It's based on sharing between humans and between generations. The idea of Buen Vivir and the indigenous people in the Americas is let Mother Earth lead. So everything centers around the planet and the earth, and everything else derives from that. The idea of Buddhist happiness, as you well know, is respect all sentient beings. Have compassion with the others and everything that lives. Therefore, the concepts of development in these traditions are different. Development from the Western perspective is about GDP growth. It's about growth of production and consumption. The more we produce and the more we consume, the better we say our society is fair. If we define that from an African perspective, it's completely different. Africans say to me, development is not important. It is all about harmonious, intergenerational human relations, including the future humans, for which we have to have enough natural resources to survive. For the Buen Vivir perspective and the indigenous people, they take it one step further. They say it's about harmonious biocentric relations, so humans and nature need to live in harmony. And from the Buddhist perspective, well-being is actually defined as inner peace and harmony. Therefore, in all four traditions, sustainability is also defined differently. Sustainability from the Western perspective is about balancing the economic domain, the social or human domain, and the environmental domain. And it's based on the idea of conservation of the environment, where we remove the people from the environment in order to protect it. In Ubuntu, it's looked at differently. In Africa, they say it's all about sharing with one another, but also sharing with nature and the earth, because the ancestors are located in the earth. The ancestors are not like in Christianity in heaven. They are in earth, and the future generations also depend on earth. Therefore, we need to respect earth. From the indigenous Buen Vivir perspective, sustainability is all about living in harmony with nature, because nature and Mother Earth is the life giver. We all are born from nature. And in the Buddhist happiness tradition, sustainability is very much about respect and guardianship and reverence for the sacred nature of nature. Therefore, we can say the Western perspective is a very much individualist-oriented perspective. The Ubuntu perspective in Africa is a collective perspective. And so is the Buen Vivir indigenous perspective, which is collective, including nature. And we can say roughly that the Asian perspective is actually mediating in between those two. Now we go to the conclusions. So what can those three philosophies mean for our future world, and what could change after the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm not saying this is a prediction, these are questions that you can reflect upon. So for example, in Buen Vivir, it's very much emphasized that you need to respect the autonomy of communities to live as part of nature. And part of that is also food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. So the question is, now that the globalization has been so fundamentally disrupted through the COVID-19 pandemic, and now that we see that we are reorganizing society in more digital working from home and less traveling, and also what we call reshoring of activities, just cutting up the global value chain and bringing activities back home. So not outsourcing them to cheap labor countries, but trying to put them back into our own economies. So might this link up with the idea of producing locally and local autonomy of these philosophies, especially in Ubuntu and Buen Vivir, and a more responsible trade chain, where we do not externalize environmental and social costs? Secondly, regarding to taxation, can we use instruments of taxation to protect the environment and have a more sound global natural environment to prevent these kind of zoonotic pandemics to happen? And secondly, can we also look at ways to tax multinational global corporations that often avoid taxes through global tax havens? So could we look at taxing pollution and taxing the CO2 emissions that cause climate change? So taxing the negative and rewarding the positive. Could we also look at taxing great data collector monopoly organizations such as Google or Facebook, who are often escaping taxation and collecting enormous global power? And could we instead reward the labor of people, the energy and the creativity? So reward the positive and tax the negative, so that we balance the two, the social and environmental cost versus the economic growth. Thirdly, can we look at international finance and trade flows and prevent this disruptive idea of speculation, especially in the financial realm, that causes so much havoc on the economic system? And there have been ideas already many years ago of taxing global financial trade flows in order to prevent this speculation. Fourthly, can we look at democracy and the rule of law and still continue to protect our privacy, even though we need to also collect data on global health pandemics? And can we find a way of cohesion and solidarity in society? So can we look at responsible ways and guidelines for surveillance and data collection on pandemics and people's private information? Can we find ways of balancing individual rights and freedoms with duties of individuals towards the community, and solidarity rights as they are known in, for example, the tradition of Buen Vivir? Can we, for example, also look at solidarity of redistributing a vaccine once it's invented for the COVID-19 pandemic, so that everybody has free access? And lastly, to prevent these kind of pandemics to happen, can we look at ways to protect nature by including rights of nature in constitutions across the world? Lastly, is there a way of balancing this geopolitical rivalry that is happening at the moment between regional powers such as China and the United States, Russia and other big global powers versus a more solidarity in solving trans-border collective problems. Solving those problems between states, between regions, and in the multilateral institutions themselves, such as in the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization, to resolve global issues such as climate and health. Is it perhaps time to balance the idea of competition, which is so much treasured in the West, to perform better? Balance that with the principle of cooperation, which is so much emphasized in collectivist societies such as in Africa and in Latin American indigenous community. Balance those two as organizing principles and find more of a peaceful solidarity society. I leave you with these thoughts and now turn to the other speakers.